we would be very foolish to provoke a war with China over Chinese access to the Persian Gulf. Now, there have always been people in Washington going back to the 1990s, people like Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz, names that should be familiar to some people who lived through the first Gulf War and then the second one in 2003. They were always interested in grabbing China by the throat by controlling the oil resources in the Middle East. I still think for them it was in the final analysis about Israel and Israel's dominance. But having said that, we would be very, very foolish to precipitate a conflict. So I suspect someone in CENTCOM was given the word that let's not provoke the Chinese over this particular vessel. In the future, we'll work on a way to get past this. I'm not sure that we at that point were really sure in great detail of what the rules of engagement were. And, you know, we've talked about this before, whether you're on land or at sea, in the air, those rules really have to be crystal clear. I'm not sure that they are. I would love to see what they're saying. And that would be very helpful. But right now, I think it was a good call to let that Chinese vessel through. Now, that vessel, once it tanks up, is going to have to come out. That's another matter entirely.
And speaking of China, Xi Jinping is saying, hey, by the way, this is a bad idea. He said, in fact, it's dangerous and irresponsible. And he said that the world must not be allowed to revert to the law of the jungle. Since there is no UNSC authorization for this, this is a unilateral decision by the United States. As you said, it's historically regarded as an act of war, pretty straightforward. You may recall back in January when the U.S. took Venezuela and stole away Maduro and said we're going to take their oil, et cetera. There was a lot of complaints that we weren't following the rule of law, we weren't following the Constitution, and there was a whole list of folks. We used to show this summarization of a lot of comments that we are the law of the jungle. We are the lion in the law of the jungle. We don't have to follow that anymore. That's the old days. Are we in the law of the jungle right now?
Well, I certainly think that this notion of international law has turned out to be hollow. International law was only workable provided we, as the leading power, was prepared to uphold it. And I think it's very clear that we're not. So I think the whole idea of international norms, you know, this nonsense about the liberal democratic order, all of that has gone down the toilet. We've thrown that overboard in Ukraine. We've thrown it overboard everywhere we've been, I would argue, certainly since 1965. In other words, international law is only international when we care to enforce it or we like it. Otherwise, we determine we're going to do whatever we want. Again, this is very popular, especially with the people that love Donald Trump. They cheer. This is being tough, and we have to be tough. If we're tough, everything will be fine. The problem is the world's changed a lot since 1962. You know, one of the things that Americans don't understand is, let's assume we decide to challenge the Chinese over their access to the strait. 2 or 3 Chinese submarines properly deployed can sink everything that we own in the Indian Ocean in no time. Then you're up against a submarine warfare challenge. I don't know how well we would do. We did very, very well in the 60s and 70s for the most part, and even into the 80s. But that's an area we don't know too much about right now. I would even argue that the age or era of large battle fleets at sea, surface fleets, is over. But if you're going to do something like this, you have to think long and hard about all of the ancillary requirements. How many small boats, how many helicopters, how many auxiliary vessels, all of these things that come into this do you have? How do you refuel and replenish while you're at sea? Where do you have to go to pick up the replenishment? It's a nightmare. I'm not sure we're totally prepared for this. I think we're already overstretched at sea. And again, we've got one carrier that's coming around the bend. I don't know what we've got up in the Mediterranean. But the point is, I don't know how long we can keep this up. And what do you do if you can't keep it up?
Well, that is the problem. That's one of the things. I mean, we talked about this on the land war itself, or the war on the Iranian landmass, because you said, we actually asked you this before the war started. How long could the United States, with this armada that had been massed up there, how long could it continue to fight? And you said it would only be some number of weeks, and then they're going to have some kind of a pause to rearm or refuel. And that's exactly what has happened. So now we're in this so-called ceasefire, but one wonders if this was not really because of what you identified early on, that by firing all these missiles, especially at pretty high rate of fire, that we're going to run out of the stockpiles we had physically located there. We're going to have to bring them in. During this time so far, we have seen profound amounts of C-17, C-5, C-130 transports flowing in from Europe and the United States into this area, which gives the impression that they're doing exactly what you suggested and restocking. But the question is, wherever they're getting this stuff from and the primary stocks, how many are there? How long can we keep going on with the missile fire or in the sea too? And I mean, those are critical questions. Do you have any estimates?
Well, I know that the Russians and the Chinese are both sending whatever they can in terms of humanitarian assistance as well as military assistance to the Iranians. So I think large numbers of Chinese missiles and certainly missile parts, radars, and so forth have flowed into Iran during this pause. In other words, if this turns out to be not much more than a pause, and I think that's eminently possible, it's possible that by next Monday, we will feel confident that we've refurbished the force to the point where we can renew the war. I mean, I would not exclude that by any means. The ceasefire will only last as long as we see some benefit to it. And since the ceasefire itself is not going to produce the collapse of Iran or anything else, I don't think it's going to last that long. Second part of this that nobody ever brings up is what happens to the petrodollar. I mean, the petrodollar is on the skids as it is. Right now, Iran has already begun urging everybody to pay for oil in yuan. Frankly, they'll take other forms of currency, but they're not going to take dollars. I think we're staring at the end of the petrodollar. If this lasts much longer, we've had it. And people don't seem to understand how important the petrodollar is. By compelling everybody to do business in the energy markets with dollars, you ensure that the dollars that are spent end up being reinvested in the United States in our treasury bonds. That's being the modus vivendi, the engine of our prosperity. If that stops, and I think that's almost a certainty that it will, our entire economic way of life is going to change, and we're not going to like it very much, certainly not at the beginning. And then finally, you've got the problem of, all right, you've refurbished for how long again? Is it another 10-day stretch, another 2-week stretch? And it's just not clear. The problem with this is the same one that we've had with other American operations in the past. This quarantine was an exception. That was very carefully thought through. What do we want to accomplish? How long do we think this is going to last? What's our methodology? And what do we want things to look like when it ends? All of that worked out. Again, we were operating in our home waters, and the Soviets discovered that they were too far from home to sustain themselves in a serious conflict with the United States. We now are in the same position the Soviets were. We're trying to sustain ourselves 6,000 to 7,000 miles from home ports, airfields, and so forth. We don't have a lot of support. The Europeans aren't supporting us, and for very good reason. They think this is crazy. It's destabilizing. It's destroying the global economy. They want nothing to do with it. The Japanese, the South Koreans, the Chinese are all in the same boat. There's no benefit to any of them of this lasting too much longer. Although, if you're Chinese and you have a huge petroleum strategic reserve, and they do, you probably are good for another 2 months or so, maybe 3. And they also have developed and looked for alternatives, and they've tried to develop renewables at home. So I think the Chinese are probably better positioned to outlast this than almost anybody. But everybody else is on the razor's edge. The longer this goes on, the more and more and more of our former friends, partners, allies, whatever you want to call them, will desert us. And we'll be standing there all alone, going broke in the process, because all of this has to be funded. And how much does it cost a day for us to maintain this fiasco? Is it $1 billion, $1.5 billion? I don't know, but I'm sure it's a great deal of money. And again, we're deeply in debt. Our position is not improving in that regard. We can't stop inflation, and this sort of thing always feeds inflation. Wars create inflation. And that's the reason why you want to avoid it. So I don't see any good news for President Trump and his administration with this particular approach.
Well, and I want to go down that path you just mentioned there about the allies, because that is really important. President Trump has been really trying to knuckle down and put lots of pressure on our allies, both in Asia and in Europe, to say, hey, why aren't y'all coming and helping us? I mean, we're just asking for a little bit of help, is the way he put it yesterday. And that's still not working out. That's yesterday. UK not supporting U.S. blockade of the strait. He's saying, "Yep, we're not gonna participate." That even after the pressure he's been getting, and then now I think overnight here we had Giorgia Meloni from Italy, that Trump took her to task because first she said something about the Pope, that obviously that she didn't like that. She said something about his denunciation, but then the real issue was he denounced her for not helping to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. President Trump just thinks, hey, I just need more boats. I just need more ships and stuff, and that's going to get the strait opened up. But let me just ask you, Doug, let's just say that the pressure worked and NATO writ large, every one of us, and maybe Japan and South Korea too, they said, you know what, here is our Navy, use it as you see fit. Will that open the Strait of Hormuz if the Iranians decide to keep it closed?
No, obviously not. And if you go back and look at the Dardanelles in 1915, what stopped the biggest and the greatest Navy in the world, the Royal Navy at the time in 1915? It wasn't an opposing naval force. It consisted of mines, heavy guns, ports ashore. Remember what the Iranians have now that's very frightening and very threatening, which is something the Cubans did not have. They have lots of precision guided cruise missiles. These missiles can be launched in great numbers. They have tactical ballistic missiles. So anything that comes within range of the coast, and that range is 500 to 800 miles, can be picked up on persistent surveillance from space-based assets, transmitted to a whole range of possible strike systems, and everything that shows up is going to be hit, damaged, or potentially sunk. And of course, the worst thing would be if you sank some vessels in the strait itself. That would make the whole navigation business that much more difficult. So no, it's not going to help. And someone should have sat down and sort of sketched this whole thing out for, the president. I mean, you look at the Dardanelles today, and the Dardanelles were defended by about 380,000 Turkish troops. And those numbers were not consistent throughout. I mean, they fell because they had 80,000 men killed. But there were over 500,000 British and Allied troops facing them. It didn't work. The ground was just too difficult. You couldn't climb up and over these cliffs. So I think the whole idea of militarily undertaking very much of anything in the Straits of Hormuz is very difficult. Remember, the lesson of history is if you want to control a major body of water, you want to control the South China Sea, let's say. How do you control it? Well, you have to take the Philippines. You have to take Vietnam. You may want to add others to that collection. Probably want to go all the way down to Indonesia. What am I describing? Describing what the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Imperial Japanese Army did during World War II. It's the only way they could control the South China Sea. How can we ever control the Persian Gulf if we can't control the coastlines, if we cannot control the topography around the Persian Gulf? We can't do it. Again, it's back to what do you want, 1 million troops to do this? What kinds of weapons and systems do you have to have? And how long is it going to take you to get control of all these strike systems ashore? You could spend years chasing around those things because it doesn't take very many tactical ballistic missiles or cruise missiles or unmanned systems, drones, in order to put people out of business who are trying to penetrate the Gulf. This is so depressing, but it's not new. It really isn't. We've made these mistakes in the past. It's just sad and unfortunate that we have to witness it again.
And here's part of the problem, Doug. I mean, not that there's not a lot of problems you've already enumerated, but we're talking about all those things you just said. In fact, about how long, how many troops, how would they be supplied, what's the logistics system, et cetera, all those kind of things, which should all automatically end the concept phase say, all right, well, this is not a doable thing. But yet there it is. So now we've executed, or we've given the order, rather, let me not say executed. So we're allegedly going to do it without having given any of those things thought. But now that they're actually President Trump, and now through some of his informal advisors like General Jack Keane, apparently is saying, hey, we're already thinking about what comes next, as Jack Keane here enumerated.
The second phase of this operation, the president has given a warning order to Admiral Cooper to do just what I'm about to say, clear the Straits of Hormuz, and you saw a couple of ships doing that over the weekend, to get the mines that may be in that area out. And we have underwater drones trying to identify some of these mines that the Iranians planted that are not tied to anything, and they lost control of them. That will be done, and then we have to secure the Straits of Hormuz, and then escort transit through the Straits of Hormuz. That will take some time to do that, but that will certainly block any intimidation or coercion that Iran still may have on the merchant owners of its ships.
So all we have to do, Doug, it's not that hard, really, is just take control of the Strait of Hormuz, clear the mines that are out in there, and then escort all the ships through that we want to come through, and everything will be fine with that. I mean, what's the problem?
Yeah, well, that's sad. Let's be frank. You're going to clear these mines, and you're going to do so right under the guns of your enemy. It's bad enough to try and clear mines in any setting at all. It's very dangerous. Many of these can be command detonated. They're not all the same. And you've got to get people underwater. You're going to use these unmanned submersibles. I'm sure some of that will work. You also have another problem with the way the currents operate in the Gulf. If there are mines dumped into the Gulf, they have a habit of being caught up in an eddy, and they continue to sort of rotate inside these waters. In other words, they don't necessarily flow out to sea. So you're going to do all of this, and now you want to do it right under in this case, we're not talking about guns anymore. We're talking about missiles, cruise missiles, tactical ballistic missiles, and unmanned systems. We've been listening to this administration tell us for the last 30 days that 90+% of all the strike systems have been identified and destroyed, so that the numbers of missiles and launch systems left are at something like 10%, that 90% is eliminated. Well, we know that's not true. That's just patently false. We knew when the ceasefire started that you still had at least 45 or 50,000 drones. In addition to that, you probably have 15 to 20,000 missiles. I suspect now, thanks to the Chinese and the Russians, those numbers have gone up substantially. And remember, it's a lot easier for the Chinese and the Russians to reach Iran than it is for us to reach all the ships at sea and all the airfields that we have to use in order to attack Iran. So I think, if we look at the price right now of petroleum, in March, it rose 21%. 21%, the highest increase since 1967. Fuel oil prices are up by 31%. Now we're not even beginning to talk about all the other products, petrochemical feedstocks, aviation fuel, grid balancing, fertilizers. If you don't get those to market, which is a huge problem right now, you're looking at massive industrial production shutdowns. That's already happened with plastics all across Asia. It's happening now to a lesser extent, but increasingly with microcircuitry. In other words, we're not just talking about driving Iran into the sea or destroying Iran. You're talking about a global energy system that is being brought to a standstill, not by something Iran has done, but by what we have done. How many times do we have to remind everyone that we are the ones, along with the Israelis, that attacked Iran? We were not attacked. When we attacked Iran, we caused Lloyd of London's to immediately cease underwriting the movement of any ships with insurance. So Lloyd's of London, they stepped in, they shut down the strait. After that, it was a foregone conclusion that as long as there was fighting, the strait would not open. So now we have a ceasefire, supposedly. The ceasefire is supposed to be the prelude, we all hope, for some sort of reasonable negotiated settlement. That seems unlikely because we continue to put forth Israeli demands to the Iranians. And the Iranians have no intention ever of submitting to those demands from Israel. They know what this war is all about. People will talk about China and other things. That's nonsense. This war is about the Israeli state and the supremacy of the Jewish state throughout the entire region. And their agents inside the United States are holding us hostage to that outcome. We can't produce that outcome right now. And the longer it takes, the weaker we look. The longer it takes, the more likely others are to enter the conflict. And thus far, we have always waved them off and said, oh, no one will ever do that. Oh, they'll never do that. What? The Turks? They'll never do anything. The Egyptians? They'll never do anything. The Chinese? They'll never do anything. How many times do you have to do this? I remember sitting around in January of 2022 with a round table of people in Washington, D.C. and said, oh, the Russians would never intervene in Ukraine. Why? That would be catastrophic for their economy. They could not sustain it. They couldn't withstand the pressure. We are stupid. We have to understand that when you give people no alternative, no other way to extricate themselves from the crisis, they will fight. And so now we've learned that the Iranians are not going to submit. There will be no capitulation. There will be no surrender ceremony on the battleship Missouri for President Trump to show up and attend. It's not going to happen. And the CENTCOM commander, Admiral Cooper, I don't know anything about the man. I don't think he's Alfred Thayer Mahan. He's certainly not Chester Nimitz. It doesn't make any difference. He can't do what President Trump is ordering him to do, not unless he's prepared to lose a lot of ships and do a lot more damage inside the Persian Gulf. Remember, the remaining oil infrastructure and salination plants inside the Gulf are still at risk. And the Iranians have made it clear, if you attack us, you destroy these things, we will wipe all of it out on the western coast. Well, that puts us out of business in the Persian Gulf for a decade, Dan. We're looking at a decade of stoppage. The whole world will suffer terribly from this. So it's just not going to work.
And if we stopped right there about what that second part of what Jack Keane said was the follow-on mission that apparently has already been given as a prepare order by President Trump to Admiral Cooper. So the question is going to be if that's unsustainable, if you can't get that part done, then you can really stop the conversation there. Unfortunately, the conversation hasn't been stopped there because it is now very clear, painfully clear by what I'm about to show you, that lesson has not been learned, or not even lesson. Those realities are not understood, that it's something that we can't physically do, because piled on top of that, now that we're talking about these negotiations again. Now, as a quick reminder to everybody, of course, last Saturday, there was the meeting in Islamabad between the United States and Iran, and then ended with Vance walking out and saying, well, we gave them our best final offer and they didn't take it. Now then we're saying, all right, well, maybe that wasn't the last offer. Maybe we'll go back again, maybe on Thursday. So there may be another meeting on Thursday. Well, Vice President Vance, I guess it was last night, put a little bit of a clarity on what he would be looking for at this negotiation. And you tell me as you're watching this, what do you hear different from here that might sound differently or get a different reaction from the Iranians?
There are two things in particular where the President of the United States really said we have no flexibility. We have to get to the outcome that the president said. On the first of those things, what some people call the dust, which is the enriched uranium that the Iranians currently possess, we have said that we want that to come out of their country, and we would like to take possession of it. Now, why does that matter? That doesn't matter, of course, because they have access to that material now. That material is actually buried underground by Operation Midnight Hammer. But if you think about this over the long haul, the president doesn't want to leave the next president or the president after that to be worrying about this program. And so we would like to get that material out of the country completely so that the United States has control of it. And the second thing is that, again, to this point about verification, it's one thing for the Iranians to say that they're not going to have a nuclear weapon. It's another thing for us to put in place the mechanism to ensure that's not going to happen. Part of that is, of course, to ensure that they don't have the ability to enrich uranium, which is how they got so close to a nuclear weapon before.
So, I mean, why would Iran do those kinds of things when they see you can't even really do this first one here? What do you think about that?
For Iran, it's a matter of national sovereignty. This means if they're going to comply with these demands, that they're effectively turning over the enriched uranium to us, and they're allowing us to conduct intrusive inspections. Now, the JCPOA that was passed under, or not passed, the wrong word, that was agreed during the Obama administration addressed all of these things. President Trump, under great pressure from his Zionist billionaire donors, threw it out. Now he's asking not only for intrusive inspections, he wants no uranium enrichment at all. I'd say it's a non-starter, and there's no point in meeting to discuss anything. If you're an Iranian right now, however bad the damage is to your country, you know that you hold the strategic initiative. You don't have to put 50,000 troops around the straits. You control the straits with precision strike, precision fires. You don't have to have large numbers of people there. A few is always helpful, and that's what they've got. A few who are very good at doing what they do with the small boats and the submersibles and so forth. But they don't have to do anything else. They also know that if we continue down this road and we renew the attacks on Iran, that the world is going to be deeply alienated and turn violently against us. We could actually see a coalition of nations that come together. And I don't want to speculate on who could be in the coalition, but I think some people in America would be surprised, who simply come together and say, enough. And if you don't stop, we will treat you and your forces anywhere we find them as the enemy. That's how serious the crisis is around the world. Now, we haven't talked a lot about what's happening in Japan or the problems in Korea. And I hope we'll talk a little bit about what's going on in Europe, because what the European heads of state are saying, look, we can't do this. They don't say publicly, stop attacking Iran, but privately say it's got to stop. It can't go on. Pretty soon they'll say it publicly, because we can't live with this outcome. So Iran's in the driver's seat. What we expect to get from another round of talks is beyond me, other than window dressing, the image or illusion of some sort of legitimate approach to peace. There is none right now.
And I wonder, Doug, if this is evidence that maybe we need more time to get more ammunition into theater, et cetera, because I was thinking, look, there's no real reason to think that Iran is going to have magically changed its position, especially in light of we're still in the ceasefire situation. By the way, the Iranian side is doing the same as we are. They are definitely restocking and resting their forces and getting ready for the next phase. They are doing everything they can with that. So they're just getting recovered, I guess, militarily from the first round of this so far. So are we. But now the advance has offered nothing new here. So one wonders, why would you be talking to go back on Thursday when you literally just said on Saturday night, this is our final last offer? But then he's not offering anything different at all, and something that he knows for sure the Iranians, it's a non-starter. So why do you think that they're offering a Thursday meeting?
No one has told us the truth from the beginning of this operation until now. We've never had a truthful picture of what we have and have not accomplished. We've had to listen to the little Air Force 4-star stand there like an accountant reading from a spreadsheet and tell us we have attacked 7,000 targets. We have hit every target and we have been successful and we have accomplished all of the assigned tasks. Well, that's like saying, well, the patient over here who's terminal, we cut off his left leg. We patched him up, near his heart, and we're very successful. Obviously, in the meantime, the patient is dead. But nobody bothers to mention that. You didn't tell us to keep the patient alive. You told us to operate, so we operated. This is stupid. This is counterproductive. This is insane. It will come to nothing. But President Trump doesn't want to suffer the humiliation of admitting that we've done all that we can do. Military force is now no longer the right answer, and we're going to take a different approach. And we are going, in the meantime, to disengage our forces from the current conflict. We are going to look to other mediaries, others who are willing to help us to negotiate a more favorable outcome than we can get on our own. That's humiliating for him. He can't do it. A great man can do it. He can't do it. This is the product of Roy Cohn. Everybody should look up Roy Cohn, who was his mentor. C-O-H-N, first name Roy. That man was one of the most evil, despicable human beings on the face of the earth. And he imparted his wisdom to President Trump, and President Trump has lived by it. And one of his rules was never admit anything, never admit defeat. Say you were successful when you weren't. Say that you're in charge when you're not. In other words, never, ever behave truthfully towards anyone. Because if you admit defeat in any way, shape, or form, if you admit that you weren't able to accomplish something, the rest of the world will destroy you. That's his philosophy. His philosophy is straight from Roy Cohn, and that's why we're not going to see any change.
But the problem with that is, though, you can't sustain this. You can't sustain it in the Gulf. You can't sustain it with our air power, and more importantly, and we're going to get to this in a minute with the economic impacts of all this. We can't sustain it with our economy, the price of gas, and all the things that go on along with that. So something is going to have to give here, and we really can't talk about this portion without talking about the elephant in the room, and that is the Israeli side. We showed a soundbite yesterday of Benjamin Netanyahu, I think on Monday, declaring openly that he got a report from J.D. Vance while he was involved in these negotiations, and that he said he gets daily briefings from the national security folks in the White House. So, I mean, by all accounts, he's the one who's calling the shots here, and President Trump, and I just cannot for the life of me understand why he allowed, first of all, even before this started, with the agreement that he got for the ceasefire negotiated by the Pakistanis, who said that a ceasefire in Lebanon was absolutely a non-negotiable part of it, which, of course, the Israelis to today still continue to violate it to make sure that everybody knows that it's not President Trump that's in charge, but it's in Benjamin Netanyahu. And if he didn't want a ceasefire, he won't. Where do we go from here if that maintains its power over our White House?
First, I would urge everyone to go back and watch the portion of the Republican National Convention before the election in 2024, where an Israeli flag, an enormous Israeli flag, was plastered on the wall behind the speakers, and there was a sign that said Israel first. And a representative from AIPAC or one of those organizations walked out, took his position up behind the podium and said, Israel first. And he says, that's what we want. And the crowd was kind of confused. Some people sat there and said, what is this? There were sort of the occasional claps, and then there was kind of a stunned silence. You have to take people at their word. You have to pay attention to what people do. So people should have gotten the message right then and there that we are headed into a new kind of American administration, one that treats Israel and its interests and the interests of its agents in the United States as preeminent, as essentially supreme and superior to all other interests of the United States. They do this by insisting that the interests of the Israelis and their agents in the United States and dominance of the Middle East to establish their supremacy, that interest is identical to our own. Well, we all know that's not true, but not very many people took that seriously. So that's the first part. The second part is that at some point, since President Trump is turning out to be unsuccessful in accomplishing all of the objectives that he was assigned by the Israel lobby and its agents in the United States, the Zionist billionaires, it may turn out that President Trump is more of a liability than an asset. If he can't get it done and he can't bring down Iran, if he can't destroy this state, well, then I guess we'll have to move on to someone else. And I think that could happen because the Congress, remember, is, with very few exceptions, just as much beholden to the Israel lobby and its donors as it is to anything else. So you don't see or listen to or hear very many objections from people on the Hill to what President Trump is doing. Oh, they'll attack him for anything you can think of, for being a member of the Epstein class, for declaring bankruptcy 6 times in his life, whatever. But the bottom line is they're not objecting to this because they've been paid to be silent and go along. But if the Zionist billionaires tell their friends on the Hill that it's time for a change, then I suspect we could see J.D. Vance become president. The problem with J.D. Vance, of course, is no change. You're still dealing with someone who is very much in the grip of the lobby and the Zionist billionaires. Now, perhaps if he gets there, he could prove us wrong, but there's not much evidence right now to suggest that he isn't, because remember, you could not join this administration. You could not be on the ticket. You could not be part of the cabinet unless you signed on for Israel first. When you have a system that you've set up, that doesn't mean that you have to pass muster with President Trump per se, but you have someone like Larry Ellison determining whether or not someone should or should not be Secretary of State, Secretary of, Defense, we call it war now, and World War II nostalgia, or any of the other key cabinet posts, you know that you've lost control of your government. This is no longer an American government. It belongs to the people with the money who are Israel firsters. What are you doing with the White House chief of staff, Susie Wiles, who was actually on a campaign advisor in Israel for Netanyahu? This is very strange stuff. There was a time in this country when people were very, very, very sensitive to foreign influence. One of the reasons that we set up the Constitution the way we did and stipulated that someone had to be born in the United States, could not be born on foreign soil and become president of the United States, was because of Alexander Hamilton. People didn't trust him because they knew that he was privately very pro-British. We just fought a revolution to dislodge the Brits, to divorce ourselves from the British Empire. Why would we want a man like Alexander Hamilton in the presidency? This is something it's not entirely new, but it really is new in the sense that the government is not in the hands of Americans acting exclusively, primarily in the interests of the United States and the American people.